Really, without further ado, welcome to the Kensington Upfronts Nonfiction Showcase. To everyone in attendance, thank you for coming. And I want to get right into talking about these three authors and their titles. And what I will do first is introduce briefly Dr. Angela Marshall, author of Dismissed: Tackling the Biases That Undermine Our Healthcare. Also joining us is Dr. Jen Gunter, author of Blood: The Science, Medicine, and Mythology of Menstruation. And last to join us, but certainly not the least, is Pashtana Durrani, the author of Last to Eat, Last to Learn: My Life in Afghanistan, Fighting to Educate Women. Now, before we get into the Q&A bit of it, can I just throw it to you, Dr. Marshall, so you can sort of introduce yourself and the book and sort of explain a little bit about how it came to be?
Yeah, sure. My name is Angela Marshall. I'm a women's health specialist, but I practice primary care for women. I know Dr. Gunter is an OBGYN, so it's interesting that we have two women's health providers here. And in my years of practice, I've seen a lot of situations where patients have felt dismissed in healthcare settings. And I've personally experienced situations where I felt like I wasn't heard or my concerns were dismissed. And so one of the things that I sought out to do in writing this book, Dismissed, is to highlight some of the challenges that patients face in the healthcare arena when they're bringing their most vulnerable selves to be cared for, and what happens when they're not listened to, or what happens when they feel like they're being dismissed. But in writing the book, I wanted it to be solutions oriented. So in addition to shining a light on the issue, I also have some recommendations on what I think can be done to help improve the patient experience.
Great, thank you. Dr. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about your work and what you are writing in Blood?
Yeah, so I'm an OBGYN, and I've been sort of in the public, I would say, education arena about women's health for quite a long time. And this is kind of the third book in a series. I have the Vagina Bible and the Menopause Manifesto. And the idea of this book kind of came out really based on just all of the menstrual mythology that is still persistent on social media. I mean, it's amazing to me that people are talking about things as if they're true. And these are the same myths that a lot of them that were around when I was 16 or 17, they've just been repurposed for TikTok. And unfortunately, what we have now is we have, careless news media that take these videos and then amplify them, and it becomes, these viral moments about toxins in tampons or the birth control pill being evil or all these types of things. And many of them are also really rooted in misogyny. And people don't realize that when they're, when they're spreading these myths. So this book is, like my others, prescriptive, but also based in some of the history of how we got here, because that explains a lot of it. And it's basically a walkthrough, why we menstruate, what are the problems that happen with menstruate, when we menstruate, what are the therapies, and of course, how to spot the mythology.
Thank you. And Pashtana, can you tell us about the work you do, which is vibrant work, and what you're trying to do with Last to Eat, Last to Wear?
Thank you so much for having him. It's definitely fascinating to hear from two amazing authors on women's healthcare, which is somehow broken in Afghanistan. There is no system in place. So it's always fascinating to hear about all the things that are happening all around the world. About me, my work, I am a social and political rights activist. By profession, I like to call myself an educator because I have been working in this field for more than 7 years now. I started as a teenager, funny thing, but now I am an expert in cognitive, auditory, and methodologies of learning within the Afghanistan system right now. And we focus mainly on learning in native languages and preserving our culture, so that we don't lose it, because a lot of things that are happening right now is you don't get to study in Dari, and you don't get to study the subjects like sciences and technology in those in the current regime. But the book is more about, like, looking at the policies, the structures, the ways the systems were put up in Afghanistan through a funny lens, I would like to say, because it's more like, oh, you were doing that, but that was certainly wrong. So that sort of thing. But I think the most of the focus is on, like, what can be done, what could be done better, and what could we do, and how you have to believe in the potential of young people and let them do it, because for some reason it has always been like, let them have the stage, let them talk, but don't let them work, so I think that sort of thing. And it also focuses on a life of an Afghan girl who becomes a woman and who has to go through all these phases to claim that women leadership in that sphere where it's not served for the past 300 years. I'm not talking about the whole Afghanistan, I'm just talking about my tribe. So it definitely is a funny, but also very different to what you have seen in the past from Afghanistan. In the past, you have seen victimhood stories. The stories are definitely very sad, and that's how the lens have been shown. But this story is definitely more about, like, oh, things happen, but we deal with it in a funny way and we make it happen. So definitely that, yeah.
Thank you so much. And actually, Pashtana, I wanted to come right back to you and ask you about the title and what the title "Last to Eat, Last to Learn" means to you, and what you hope to convey to readers.
So I'm not going to take the credit for this, because this is basically my co-author Tamara's title that she came up with. So we kept on talking about how girls are the oldest girls, or the eldest girls are the ones who are picked the last to eat, because they have to take care of the parents, they have to take care of the siblings, and they feed everyone, they feed all the younger siblings, they feed their parents, and then they're the last ones to feed themselves. And then that's where they prioritize themselves. So they are always the last ones to eat. And me being the eldest, I don't say I relate to it because I come from a privileged background, but there have been times where my father passed away and I had to prioritize my siblings and my mother before me. And then the second part is about last to learn. So there's a concept that people normally don't understand. It's like, oh, these are all children, so they all must get the same opportunity. But here's the weird thing about it. Girls normally don't get to be the first one to learn. A boy, if he's the oldest one or the eldest one, he gets to go to the school first. He's fed first. He gets the access to internet, laptop, resources first. If it's a younger girl, because she's always the loved one, she also gets the same access, or at least like a 50 to 60% of that access. But if it's the oldest girl, she's expected to sacrifice her study time to take care of the younger sibling, to do the house chores, because she is the elder. So the title was basically Tamara's innovation. She's like, oldest girls are always picked last to eat and last to learn. She has always to be up like late in the night to do her normal study that she should be doing in the day, because she was doing work with her younger siblings or taking care of them. So that's the title, yeah.
One quick follow-up. When you say the eldest girl, what age range would you say a lot of these young women fall into?
It's weird when I say this. Sometimes you can be 6 years old and you are the oldest one, so you're supposed to clean out the whole house and you are supposed to take care of your younger brother. I remember when I was, I think 7, and I was holding my brother, and he was like a huge baby, and he was a big baby, and I couldn't hold him properly, and my mom was working with the guests, and suddenly he slipped from my hands and he broke his eyebrow. I'm still blamed for it, by the way, but this was not supposed to be my job. So sometimes you could be 6 or 7 years old, sometimes you could be a teenage girl, and sometimes you could be older and 20, 25, and you're still expected to take care of siblings who might be 2 years younger than you, you know?
Wow, that's a hard number to really wrap your head around. Jen, I'd like to move on to you. Um, uh, Blood takes some aim at the patriarchy that is surrounding the weaponization of menstruation. Can you go into that a little bit more and give us an example or two of just what you mean by that?
Well, sure. I mean, walk through the grocery store or the drugstore and look at all the aisles of products that are there to make women smell better, right? And this sort of pervasive belief that you're dirty and toxic, and whether that leads, I mean, multiple religions require women to be excluded from participating when they're menstruating, right? In some places, women are not even allowed to prepare food in their own home. But, we see this everywhere, almost everywhere. There are obviously some matriarchal cultures where it's not the same, but the vast majority of societies still have it's based on the old humoral belief of the four humors. And this idea, the basis of medicine is that women have inferior bodies to men, and menstruation was visible proof of that. So we're living with that legacy today. I mean, whether it's as it's obviously stated or it's, more of a subliminal message. But, when we tell people that, they can't participate in religion, or that they have to pay taxes on menstrual products, right? So we're taxing half the population, right, for something that every single person depends on. We treat menstruation as if it's an individual person's fault, as opposed to the thing that exists so we can all be here. If we didn't have menstruation, we wouldn't have the brains that we have. We wouldn't have the ability to walk upright that we have. We wouldn't have to be able to use our hands the way we have, because it's all designed to optimize pregnancy outcomes for walking upright and having a big head. So, which is a big brain. So menstruation is the wheel that drives humanity, but it's actually treated as a fault. So that's my short summary on that.
Thank you. And you said something about the information that we're told or fed. You can, where do you lay the blame in terms of this misinformation getting out? And do you have do you have, how do you tell what is a reliable source of information or not? Where do you go? Where would a young woman or anyone go to get more accurate information about this stuff?
It's so, first of all, I would say lay the fault in our school systems, where we, most people graduate high school knowing more about frog biology than human biology. And I'm not saying that learning frog biology isn't important or interesting, but, we teach human biology almost in a no sex, please, we're British kind of way, as opposed to this is what happens to your body. We're able to teach driver's ed and not worry that everybody's going to go out and drive on the wrong side of the road, right? So there would be no reason that we couldn't teach about human bodies and how they work and what's pleasurable and what isn't. That doesn't mean everybody's going to go out and do it. In fact, studies actually tell us it's the opposite, right? So we have this systematic, lack of education. We have a society that specifically tells women that, that they're bad if they engage in sexual activity early, and if it's fine for men. And, anything that goes along with your period is sort of all signs that you are now pregnancy capable. And obviously then now that have the potential to be a slut, basically, right? So that's all part of it. So there's all these complex messages. And, we have in the United States and in many parts of the world, this vastly unregulated supplement industry, right? And this sort of alternative medicine that preys on these gaps. We have lots of people who can't get care, who go and get dismissed. And instead of then, being able to find how to get to a better provider, what happens is they basically get lured in by charlatans. And so we have this growing problem in the United States with naturopaths who have very little training, who basically are basically practicing witchcraft from 1800s. They're practicing a sort of medicine pre-germ theory, and promoting, we have this supplement industry which has no regulation. And when you don't when telling the truth isn't something that you need to do, you can pretty much say anything, right? So we have all these forces, and then we of course, only included women in studies, it's like the late 1990s. So we never even considered the impact of the menstrual cycle on vaccination, on your high blood pressure medication, on all these other types of things. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons we're behind the 8 ball.
Okay, thank you. That was discouraging, in a lot of ways, to be honest. But this sort of the sense of all of these charlatans and the supplement industry being sort of a source of misinformation. Dr. Marshall, your book is tackling many forms of bias, right? And I want to talk about why you chose as many forms as you did in this comprehensive way. But one of the biases you cite is a bias against science, and how does that manifest in a patient? Because I'm assuming that the doctors and the healthcare providers have faith in science, unless I'm wrong. Yeah, can you talk about that bias of science that you address in the book?
Yeah, sure. So bias against science threatens the health of our communities and further damages the doctor-patient relationship. And I think part of it stems from all this misinformation that we have available. As Dr. Gunter mentioned, this proliferation of online content that is, factually incorrect, not evidence-based, this explosion of the supplement industry, the explosion of social media where people can make wild claims. And if they're provocative or interesting or, thought-provoking enough, they go viral. And then all of a sudden you have people touting therapies that are completely false or based on nothing. And so in medicine, we practice an evidence-based approach, meaning that we do clinical trials. We want to make sure that therapies are effective. And so that's why we do them in a randomized control fashion. We do a study, we have the treatment group and the control group, and we want to prove that the results that we have are related to, the therapy that we're studying. And so, it's very pervasive. Anecdotally, I'll say, I just had a patient in my office yesterday who brought a therapeutic recommendation from TikTok. And so it's created a problem, because what happens is, it creates a schism between the doctor and the patient. And so now you've got patients who are questioning the recommendations of their physicians because of things that they're reading, online that are not correct. I feel like this was really amplified throughout the pandemic. You had people that were, saying certain groups of people couldn't get the virus. There were all these therapies, just ridiculous therapies. There were, people talking about, putting your head over a boiling pot of water, and just ridiculous therapies to prevent COVID. And then when the vaccine became available, there were so many people who wouldn't take the vaccine, and not to pass judgment, because I understand that, people have anxieties and fears about medicines and side effects, and everyone has a personal choice about, what therapies they take. But, we have to be able to see the scientific results. And, I like how Dr. Fauci said, science is the truth, and so we've got to have some objective facts that we can agree on. And if we don't have objective facts, then we're lost. And so we have to be able to agree on something. And that's where science, comes into play. And so I think, and the more mistrust we have, I think the more opportunities there are for anti-science bias.
I definitely saw that in the pandemic. It was sort of a screaming headline throughout it. And so to stick with you, Angela, can we talk about how you mentioned in your intro that your personal experiences being dismissed by the medical field were an important step for you. Can you go into that a little bit more and sort of talk about how this ordeals affected you?
Yeah. Well, so first let me say I've had interactions in healthcare where I felt very cared for, and I'm very grateful for those experiences. When I was in medical school, I had a son and had an experience where my son was very, very sick. And despite me going to great lengths to explain to his doctor how sick I felt he was, which, by the way, I was a medical student at the time, and so I had a little bit of medical knowledge, but I felt like the doctor just didn't get it. He just didn't, I felt like he wasn't listening to me, and ultimately, I lost my son. And it was the worst day of my life. It's taken me over 20 years to be able to talk about it, but I felt like it was an important story to tell. And initially I thought, as an African-American woman, when you feel dismissed or you feel disregarded or you feel discarded, one of the first things that comes to mind is it because I'm Black? Or is it because I'm a woman? And so initially, I started writing this book from the angle of medical racism and bias against Black people. Surely it must have been because I was Black. But then in talking to a lot of my patients, I realized that this isn't just a Black thing. This is a woman thing. This is an issue that people feel that have disabilities, people who are aging, even people with obesity. And so it goes on and on and on. There's so many things that there, is bias around. And so that's why I decided to open it up and really make it more about culture bias in general and not just racial bias.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. That's an awful story about your son and what you experienced. I think you very kindly actually opened up the other question I was going to ask about why you decided to write about more than just bias against women or racism. And it seems like in the process of exploring this topic, you just found that it's pervasive across all different types of people, regardless of the color of their skin, their sex, their disabilities or whatnot. And that's a hard pill to swallow. I really believe that. Pashtana, I want to come back to you. Your father had a huge impact on you, and how he insisted on your equality in a male-dominated society. Can you talk a little about him and his impact on your life?
Sure. I mean, for me, of course, my father was the center of my world and still is. I do strongly believe in his values, and I tend to follow them even unconsciously, even if I'm not trying to. So I think for me, so my mother says this: when I was born, my grandma passed away 14 days before I was born. Normally, that is a bad thing. It's like I don't have a good luck, but even when I was born, somebody died in the family. But when I was born, my mom says my father was in such a huge depression. He loved his mother. His mother was like his feminist icon, and he looked up to her. And she stood up against my grandfather when he got married the second time. And she's like, you know what? This is my boundary. I am leaving this house. And she raised all her kids, like I think 12 or 14 kids on her own. So she was like this goddess for all of us. Like I still love my grandmother. I have never met her. I don't know a lot about her, but the things I know, I love that. And my mom says that when she passed away, my father wouldn't even let my uncles touch her, like her body, because he was so depressed. And he's like, nobody came for her. Nobody was there for her when she was there for you guys all along. She passes away 40 days later. I am born, and people were expecting a son. I was born after 2 years of marriage, after a lot of sacrificing of lamb and a lot of prayers to God. And I was a girl, I was not a boy, which is expected. All my uncles have like 7 boys and 1 daughter, which is like born in the last. And she's like the favorite one. And this was unheard of. And he was the tribal chief of 10,000 people. So people expected a son who would continue the legacy. So when I was born, my mom says, he just picked you up in the hospital and he looked at you and he's like, you know what? She's going to be my son, which is, by the way, now I do contradict it. I'm like, why did he say that? But in a sense, for a man whose district was filled with refugees, who lived in a refugee camp, who struggled all his life, who saw women near him being abused, being told to shut down. I think for him, he really wanted to raise this daughter as a son because he wanted to break those barriers, because he didn't have the control over his life when it was his mother's or when it was his sister's. So he wanted to do the same, like better things for me. So I was born, I was raised to a very long time. I think until even college, I used to wear boys' clothes, like all Afghan boys' clothes, and I was raised as a tomboy. And I remember once me and my father getting into an argument, and he's like, you know what, like, you know, I was like, you didn't let me do makeup. Why wouldn't you let me do makeup? And he was like, I was worried you'll get all like, you know, thinking about makeup and then you'll forget your goals and careers. And I was like, yeah, that was not a nice way. And he's like, you're my son. I was like, I don't want to be your son, because in Islam, the girl is supposed to get a 25% share and the boy gets 50% share. So it's like 1/2 of like what the boy gets. And my brother, he's supposed to get 50 and I'm supposed to get 25 and my sister is supposed to get 25. So I was like, yeah, no, I don't want to be your son. This fake son thing doesn't work. If I don't get a share in the proper way, like my brother is getting, I don't want to be called your son. And he laughed so much, and he's like, he thought about it and he went on and talked to his friends. He's like, I was definitely going to do that, but I'm so happy that my daughter pointed it out to me. So when he passed away, all his friends were actually witnesses, and he actually left the 3 of us the same share for his daughters and for his son, the same thing. So I think for me, it's important to, when I talk about my father, he was not just doing it because I was his daughter, so it was important to him. He did the same thing for his sister when she was being abused. He got her the divorce. It's unheard of in our communities. We don't do divorces. He made her take a divorce. He sent her to a boarding school. He educated her. He got her a job, and he made sure that she's supported through her life. And then when I was born, he did the same thing for me. So for me, I think my father had this impact of like, you know, not raising a son. In his head, a son meant an independent person who makes their own choices. And in our community, that is only possible when you have an education, when you're educated, that beyond these boundaries, I have the right to vote, to educate, to work, to talk about anything and everything. I mean, there have been times where I've gotten into fight about women's second marriages or abortions or like different rights that are unheard of. And he would listen. He was not dismissive. He wouldn't impose his theories on me or what he was taught. And it's fascinating. I think that makes me happy that someone like him raised me in middle of the village, in middle of war. I grew up until I was age 14 in a mud house. So for me, when I look at the world and I see a lot of people, even in the West, and they have such a misogynistic view about stuff. And then I think about my father and I'm like, huh. So it doesn't matter where you live. It's actually how you look at women and how you tend to want to respect them, or how you want to be the partners who support or allies who want to support women in all fronts. So for me, my father had a lot of impact on my life. He was a big supporter of education. He would come pick me up, and after I was done with school, that was unheard of. My cousins would like, you know, laugh. My mom says when he was to pick me up and like carry me around, that was unheard of. So for me, yeah, I can go on and talk about it for a long time. But for me, yes, the feminism that comes in me and the one that is so staunch and so focused on like all women leadership is, I think, because of him, because he focused on it, because he believed in it. So yeah.
Your father sounds like a fascinating guy.
Yes, he was.
Yes, and yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my father too. Uh, Thank you for that. That's awesome to hear. Jen, can I move on to you? I'd like to find my questions. You know, part of the book discusses the fact that women were not included in medical studies, and so these medicines and were created, you know, by male doctors, and sort of retrofitted for use with women. Is it true that as late as 1993, the U.S. government hadn't yet really required the inclusion of women in medical studies in the United States?
Yeah, that is true, in fact. And you know, on one hand, you can absolutely, I can understand why researchers don't want to. When you want to study something, you want a uniform population that's the same all the time. And when you have hormonal changes going up and down, that's not the case. So if you're trying to get your drug to market in the cheapest, fastest way, you want, I mean, everybody, you want a whole group of, you know, people of the same race, the same age, you want to minimize all your variables, which is obviously wrong, because then you're designing a drug for a very narrow segment of the population. And if we don't study, you know, the diverse range of people that we have, then we don't know, you know, and now we're finding out that some drugs work better for different people. And this is really important information. So you can understand how that happens. It doesn't make it right at all. And when you know better, you do better, right? So because there was so little diversity in medicine, you know, 50, 60, 70 years, probably even 30 years ago, people never even had those thoughts, which is of course wrong, but now we know better. And so, you know, if it requires legislation to do it, then it requires, I mean, look, I mean, this is a capitalist society. Every company is going to try to get away with doing the, you know, the most inexpensive, you know, studying whatever they're trying to bring to market in the fastest, easiest way. And that's why we need government oversight. That's why we need to know, you know, does this drug have the same impact? And, you know, what impact might it have on the menstrual cycle? And what impact does the menstrual cycle have on that medication or even that condition, right? And one of the big issues is we've really been studying women's health from a pregnancy framing, right? So there's been this assumption that we're all the same. And then it's important to look after pregnancy because, you know, you want to, the fetus needs to survive, which I'm not saying that's not important, but that also then positions women as breeders, right? And that's why we're, struggling to, still, manage a lot of ramifications of pregnancy because, basically all of women's care was lumped into maternal and child health, right? Which is important, but it's not the same thing. And I mean, we see this legacy in so many other things. I mean, the whole reason why we're behind in nutritional research and is it wasn't believed to be important because that was a woman's thing, cooking. So the whole, it was sort of a forgotten aspect of healthcare because, well, that was women's work, like women cook. How could that have any value to health? So, so we see these ramifications in other ways too.
Yeah, to loop Angela into this, I mean, it does seem like there's that sort of predetermined bias where like you're looking for an outcome, which, like you said, could be to efficiently and cheaply produce the medicine, and so you sort of design the testing to get what you want, right? And so to pivot to Angela, you had discussed part of the book discusses the idea of blame bias. Can you define that and explain how it impacts patients and providers?
Yeah, sure. So blame bias is when we as providers blame our patients for their condition. One example of that is in the area of obesity. I have a lot of patients who suffer from obesity. And, they've told me over the years that they've had doctors that seem to blame everything that ails them on their weight. And, certainly obesity can affect a lot of things. It comes along with a lot of, a lot of health problems. But, these are situations where women are just they're blaming everything. The physicians are blaming everything on their weight. And, and in some cases, it's even, being used as a sort of a scapegoat for the doctor to not have to do anything and say, well, hey, if you just lose weight, this should go, well, come see me after you lose weight. And, so that's a big problem. Another area we see it is in the area of, a person who gets lung cancer, well, all those years of smoking, what did you expect? And so, one of the things that, I really stress in my book is, the Hippocratic Oath and our duty to care for people in a non-judgmental, non-prejudicial way, because that's what we're called to do. And so if we're constantly judging patients and constantly making, making judgments about their behaviors or their lifestyles that led to their conditions, then that doesn't position us well to care for them. And so I think the first step, though, is being aware of some of these biases, because a lot of times when you mention the word bias in healthcare, immediately people get defensive and say, oh, well, I'm not biased. I don't have bias. But understanding that everyone has bias, it's literally how the brain operates. The brain likes to categorize things based on our previous experiences. And so we have to be aware of, we have to accept that we are biased human beings. We're all biased, but we have to be aware of it so that we can recognize it when it does creep in and be able to kind of deal with it as these things happen. And so I think it's really, this book was meant to be a conversation starter about it in a non-judgmental way, because I don't want to be biased about the bias either. So, I think it's a good, just a conversation starter.
Yeah. And what can patients do when they walk into a doctor's office? What can they have in mind? They recognize that they have, let's say they walk in and they recognize that there is this bias that they could be coming up against. What can they do to sort of counteract that? Like, how can they be an advocate for themselves?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's really important for patients to do the research to find providers that they feel comfortable with. And, oftentimes it can be tricky because sometimes, if you feel like you're not being listened to or not being heard, it could be because the doctor's having a bad day or the doctor's burned out. You don't know why. But regardless of the reason, you want to make sure that you're going to providers and physicians that see you, they hear you, they listen to what you're saying, and they care about you. And you can feel that. And so that's number one. But number two, I think it's important for people to know how to advocate for themselves if they do feel like they're being dismissed, in which case, it's important to be able to speak up and say, hey, I feel that you didn't hear what I just said, or I feel that, you're not listening to my concerns, or I feel like you don't understand how I feel. And so I think that, it's good to learn how to advocate. Back in the olden days, the doctor was kind of in charge of the doctor-patient relationship. And so, people feared speaking up more. Nowadays, I think, we have to be more assertive in the doctor-patient communications and interactions and be able to speak up in a respectful manner when we feel like we're not being heard.
No, that's great. I think it can be very intimidating speaking to a medical doctor. Most people who go to the doctor don't do the research. They don't know why they're there. They just feel ill, right? Before we run too much out of time, because we have about 18 minutes left, Jen, I wanted to ask you about gynecological research and how you note that it is slower than other forms of research. And I wanted to ask what you thought the factors were in that and what is happening to change that.
Oh, it's funding. I mean,
Money.
it's money. Yeah, it's money. We've seen, with the COVID vaccine, how you can go from, not knowing, in January, end of January, knowing, the genome of the virus to by the end of the year, having, I think we had 3 candidate vaccines, right? So that's what money does. Money allows you to do. So normally with research, you have an idea, you think about this idea, you slog away and get grants to get to this point, and now you want to test a treatment. Well, you're doing your best guess to pick the best treatment. You could have guessed wrong. When you have money, you can test all your hypotheses at once. So instead of having to do things sort of in sequence, you can do things in parallel. And that's exactly what happened with the COVID vaccine. I mean, a lot of research that we have now, couldn't have happened 30 years ago because we have technology. I was a medical student, we didn't have an MRI scanner in my province, right? So you're kind of limited to the availability of technology. But now that, genetic sequencing and being able to do this type of rapid testing where you get results back, basically the same day where you had like a week before for the lab to run it. So, we're in a different situation now. And if we compare, the funding for women's health versus funding for everything else. You look at a condition like endometriosis, which is as common as diabetes, and then you look at the funding difference and it's astronomical. It's money, it's all money. And I'll also add that the lack of money even affects who goes into it. So if you compare a urologist to a gynecologist doing the same procedure, so if a urologist does a biopsy on a vulva and I do a biopsy on a vulva, the urologist gets paid 25% more.
Wow.
Right? And who's mostly gynecologists, they're mostly women, and who's urologists, they're mostly men. So I think that, we see this, so that affects, who goes into research, who can afford to go into research, right? So if you're an OBGYN and you are paid far less than every other surgeon, which you are, because 1, you're only operating on women, and 2, you're more likely to be women. So if you're paid far less, in academics, you have to pay for your time. And so you are then less likely be able to do research because you are making less money in patient care. So, it's a real systematic issue, but it's money.
How is the money raised? For like awareness and for more research. Who is the industry and doctors? Who are they going to? Like, how does that get organized?
Well, a lot of it's NIH. That's where most large grants come from in the US. And, Canada is probably Health Canada and other, but yeah, so the NIH, and they have a certain pot of money. And, they have their own biases about what they think is important, and everybody does. It's hard to say that one disease is more important than the other, because it isn't. And so there are sometimes some difficult decisions. Say you have a relatively rare condition, but research suggests you might actually be able to cure it, right? With your research, is it more important to fund that, or the one that maybe you're not going to be able to cure, but affects more people and you could improve quality of life, right? So there's all these ethical things that come into it. So there's a lot of that. And the thing I think the average person doesn't know is, getting these grants is very challenging. You have to have a department that is paying for your time to write these grants, to do the research. And most people don't realize, when they graduate residency, if they don't land at a university that has all that machinery in place to get a grant, then you're basically probably not going to get one. So so the whole system is, is set up in a way that it's, it's kind of the equivalent of, if your parents went to college, you're more likely to go to college. If you go to a university that's got this whole grant machinery and this sort of great mentoring, you're more likely to be able to do that. So, then you have, that's where a lot of the money comes from. And then pharma, obviously, but they have their very specific, drug candidates that they're looking at, that they might spend 20 years tinkering around with 5 different molecules before they come out with one that they're actually ready to go with. And I think that's something people also don't realize is that, for every drug, and I'm not, obviously defending big pharma in any way, but it goes to show that, when you have the money like they do, you can afford to play around with different molecules. And sometimes we see drugs now on the market that they've been tinkering with for 30 years. Some guy's got an idea, then he goes back to it and has an idea and goes back to it. And then, finally they decide they think it's profitable, right? So the problem with pharma is all profitable. And that's where, rare diseases suffer, because it's very hard to make profit when you're treating it. You can make it up in volume, but you can't when there's just a few people. So, yeah.
That's fascinating. And it really is sort of a system with a complex system with a lot of different sort of battlefronts. And people fighting for money and people fighting for the time and the research. I want to turn one last time to you, Pashtana, because in the book, in Last to Eat, Last to Learn, you make this statement that, quote, the entire modern history of Afghanistan can be seen as one long-armed and violent arguments about whether or not girls should be educated. Why has this historically been such an ongoing struggle?
I mean, it's always like fascinating to talk about the history of Afghanistan, because we were not like this all the time. We might have been a poor country, but we were a peaceful country until the US and Russia thought we could be someone where they could fight their war. So they started their wars and fighting them on our ground. And then countries thought that it's a good way to promote, use books to radicalize our young generation. And I think it was University of Nebraska that actually researched books that would talk and changed. So in Pashto, we say Alif for Anar, which is A for apple sort of thing in our own scripts and literature. And then they changed it for Alif to Allah, and then Jim for Jihad, and Mujahid and Shahid. So all of those are like martyr, and like, a person who fights the holy war, Jihadi, and Jihad, which is the holy war. And then I remember I used to read these books when I was growing up, and they would say, I'm so proud of my dad because he fought the Russians and he became a martyr. I'm so proud of my brother that he is fighting against the infidels, the Russians. So that generation grew up, are the leaders of today's Afghanistan that you see on TV. So for me, I think this whole modern Afghanistan's history, it's been used, radicalized, weaponized by the world superpowers to use us to play their own war games, and to use us to have their scoring settled in a foreign land. And that's what they have been doing in the past. If you look at the ancient history of Afghanistan, by the way, Gawhar Shah Begum, she was the first queen who actually ruled from Egypt until China, and the center was Afghanistan. And she had a city that's not even now known for its minarets, and she built these minarets so that the people of Central Asia would come to this city and study here. So it was known as the city of universities. People would travel to the city. And then you fast forward to the last century, where you have Queen Soraya, the first minister of education, where in the West women didn't have the right to vote. We had a woman minister of education who was working on all of this stuff. So for me, when the world thinks, oh, it's an Afghan problem. For me, it's not an Afghan problem. It's a Western problem used and radicalized our religion against us, our culture. And then they say, oh, war feeds into this problem of girls not getting an education. Then who am I? My father never went to foreign countries and lands. He barely went to Iran. He was always like in a refugee camp and in Afghanistan. So how did he learn about education? Why did he think education was important? So for me, it's sort of a war with my own self, where I have to defend that the history of Afghanistan is educated women, but the current situation is that the war is all against women's rights, women's education. Even now, our country is failing at so many levels: economy, public health, all the sectors that you can find. We don't have a controlled border issue. We don't have people who have passports right now, or passports, everything is closed. But do you know what is the only thing that they are at war with? Teenage girls going to school. That's their only problem right now. Young girls becoming doctors. That's their issue. Imagine a country that has that issue. So for me, I think the modern history of Afghanistan is that war with women and their education. And of course, it's fed by other superpowers, and they made it possible. But at the same time, it's all about the struggle where girls want to get educated, and people or the superpowers radicalize it to a level where education is seen bad now, and nobody wants their girls to be educated.
Thank you, Pashtana. That is, chilling in a lot of ways. So I have a couple of questions for the three of you each to answer. Before I did that, was there any questions that you had for one another? This is a bit of a surprise, but if not, that's fine. I have a few more questions, but if you were curious to follow up with yourselves on any particular thing that you said, I'm going to give you the opportunity.
Well, I'm just looking forward to both of your books when they come out and seeing them. I think that's just both very, very interesting. I think Angela works probably very complimentary, just really interested in also learning more. So yeah, hoping to get both the books.
Likewise, I'd love to have lunch with you guys. It's fascinating. Can't wait to read your books.
Me too. I think I'm more fascinated by the fact that the three of us were like the panelists on this one, but now I understand why. Because when Jen talked about the funding and how it works, and it's something that I have struggled all my life with, and the reason why don't you get funding? Because your idea is so amazing. But then if you get funding, you have a solution, and then how will the humanitarian industry thrive? So I think now I see the overlap with that. And then at the same time, when you talk about biases, Angela, I think that's so true. Every time you walk into a room, if they see you're a woman, and you're a woman of color, and they're the ones who are making the decisions, they're definitely going to make it more tough for you to, make it to that last, the finishing line. So I definitely think now I understand why we were in this panel. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all very much. You're all absolutely brilliant women, and I'm just admire all three of you so much, and we're very lucky to have your books. One final question in the last 5 minutes, and I promise I'll let you go back to your lives. Many of our attendees here today either work at bookstores or at libraries, and I wanted to ask if you had any personal story about a bookstore or a library, or that meant something to you, sort of in the development of your career and the work you do now. How about Angela? You start.
Well, I grew up very poor. I hate to use that word, but very impoverished, and didn't have a local library that was close to my apartment complex. But we used to have the library mobiles back then when I was a kid. And I used to love going to the little library mobiles. I'd go and, take up all the time and just, explore the books. And it was wonderful. And so I'm so happy that libraries are proliferating in my community now. We've got some huge, beautiful libraries in the Maryland area. And I'm just so thrilled to see more funding being put towards libraries. And I think it's just wonderful that the children nowadays have way more access to these wonderful books.
Thank you. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, for me, reading was a really, really important part of my childhood. You know, I just was always just had to read, and we had a lot of books in the house, mostly because my mother left school when she was 12 or 13. She had to work for the family. And actually she bought all these books she thought she was supposed to be reading, but she actually, I figured out later in life, she didn't read very well. You know, she, you know, probably did great with sort of grade 8 or grade 9 level, but not all this literary fiction. And so our whole basement was filled with all this literary fiction that she bought. And so that's just what I would go down to the basement and read in the cold winter months. And so, you know, I just read every book that I could have. And, you know, I think that trying to impress the value of reading on my own kids with the lure of social media has been very challenging. I have one that has taken up the same, and we have great, and I'm proud to say his favorite book is the same as mine, Watership Down. I kept saying, you have to read it. You have to read it. You have to read it. It's like one of the original fantasies, but in a different way. And so I also love to see my books in the library, and I get a lot of joy when people tell me they took it out from the library, because I used to love going to the library too. I still do.
Thank you, Jen. Pashtana, you touched on this a little bit about reading and what the books that you had access to were telling you. But do you have a story about bookstores or libraries otherwise?
So I grew up in a community, we didn't have a library. We normally do have this, we call it tarcha, which is the sort of window or like this shelf that we make in our mud houses, and we put books, poetry, and like the books of our religion and stuff. So that's part of like a thing that you do. But the one thing that I remember from my childhood, and I still appreciate it so much, is whenever my father went to Afghanistan, he would bring me all these books, like history. And funny thing is, I never read like Cinderella or Snow White or stuff like that. I read the history of Afghanistan. I read Amazing Women in Ancient Afghanistan, or like, you know, when it was Iran, or when it was like, you know, all these ancient women who were these heroes. So for me, I grew up in that world. And for me, even until this day, when somebody gives me a book, I feel so happy. Part of me, I'm like, this week's thing is done. I still, but I'm sort of, I think, have evolved. I still listen to Audible a lot, because that's something that helps me sleep, and like, you know, makes me want to like take off my whole stress off my mind. I still sleep to that book. I have just finished a book right now, and whenever I'm on planes, I think the only thing I love to take with me is like my Audible or Kindle, and also at the same time like a physical book, so I can continuously like, you know, switch. So for me, it's a very important part of me. The only thing when I was sad about when I was leaving Afghanistan was my 400 books in my house. I was like, I can't leave this. And when I was crossing the border, I had that book because I couldn't finish it, so I had to take it with me, and I wanted to finish it. I think I have a big FOMO, which is like fear of missing out of what happens in the end of the book. So I'm always fascinated by books. I think they're an important tool and very important to become the person that you are. But at the same time, I think it's very important to like, you know, read and develop yourself through reading. It just makes it very genuine and authentic. You become your own person, and you know so much. So yeah. And also like one last thing, I think it's fascinating that people, when they read something through their eyes, they put the physical book and then they go out, they still can read those lines in their head. For me, I think that's the most fascinating thing about human nature. I still find it fascinating. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Pashtana. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Angela. This has been a delight. I wish you all the best in the rest of your days, and to all of our attendees, thank you for coming. This will be up on the Kensington YouTube page in like a week or something, I hope.
Great.
Thank
Thank you.
you,
It's very
Matt.
nice meeting both of
Thank you.
you.
Nice to meet you all. Thank
You
you.
all.
Bye-bye.